I'm Maya, and if you ever sat through one of my family's holiday dinners, you'd probably forget I was even there. That's how it's always been. I was the quiet one, the odd one, the one they'd glance at when it was time to politely ask, "So what are you up to these days?" This particular Thanksgiving, the air smelled like overcooked turkey and forced smiles. My parents had gone all out like they always did when Uncle Paul came into town. He made his entrance with a booming voice, expensive cologne, and a story about some investment deal in Dubai. Or maybe it was Singapore. I wasn't really listening. I'd heard it all before. Paul slid into the seat at the head of the table, like a king returning to his throne. My older brother Jacob sat on his right, the heir apparent, fresh off a promotion at a mid-tier consulting firm. Everyone beamed at him like he'd just won a Nobel. My mom had even printed out a copy of his LinkedIn profile and pinned it to the fridge like a report card. When it was my turn to speak, I barely had time to finish my sentence before Uncle Paul cut in with a laugh. "Still working security, huh? Must be fun chasing shoplifters at the mall." The room erupted in a short, polite kind of laughter, the kind that masks discomfort with cruelty. I smiled just barely and kept my eyes on my plate. What no one at that table knew was that I wasn't guarding a shopping center. I was part of a task force under the Department of Justice, but it wasn't worth explaining. Not when every time I'd tried, I was met with a tilted head and a new suggestion for how to fix my life. Law school, teaching something more respectable. Jacob was pouring wine like he owned the vineyard. Uncle Paul slapped him on the back, telling everyone how proud he was of the kid. My dad nodded along already, talking about how Jacob's firm might go public soon. I reached for the bread, hoping no one noticed my hand was shaking a little. Paul leaned in across the table and gave me that look I'd grown up with, the one that says you'll always be less. "I got a guy at my office who needs a receptionist. Good pay, air conditioning. What do you say, Maya?" I could feel my mother's foot nudge mine under the table. Her silent message was always the same. Don't make it awkward, let it go. So I smiled again. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes either. I just let the noise of their praise for Jacob drown out the part of me that wanted to scream. He had always been their success story, and I had always been the filler between applause lines. That night, I helped clear the dishes while they laughed about vacation homes and stock options. I scrubbed cranberry sauce from plates while Jacob's new girlfriend gave a toast about how inspiring he was. Uncle Paul kissed my mother on the cheek, said something about family being everything, then walked out like a man who owned the night. No one asked me how my week had been. No one noticed when I didn't say goodbye. I slipped out quietly, coat in hand, heart pounding in that dull, familiar way. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was something quieter than that, something deeper. I was used to it, used to being the shadow in their spotlight. But that night, as I drove home through the cold, quiet streets, I felt something shift. Not a snap, just a slow, steady tightening in my chest. A decision forming quiet and absolute. They didn't see me, but soon they would. In my family, job titles were more important than birthdays. If it didn't come with a LinkedIn profile or a corner office, it wasn't worth mentioning twice. So when they talked about me, it was always in vague, slightly embarrassed terms. "She's doing some kind of building security." It was their polite way of saying Maya didn't quite pan out. I was the family's side project that never got funded. And every Thanksgiving, Easter, or 4th of July came with a fresh round of unsolicited advice, disguised as concern. Maybe try online classes. You're still young enough to pivot. My aunt once slipped me a brochure for a local dental assistant program like it was a coupon. Nobody ever asked me what I actually wanted. They just assumed I'd gotten lost and needed help finding the highway back to acceptable. They thought I stood in a lobby somewhere, in a polyester uniform with a walkie-talkie buzzing in delivery guys and checking IDs. My uncle once asked if I ever got bored watching security cameras all day. I told him I didn't mind. Watching people pretend to be things they weren't was good practice for family dinners. Success in their eyes came with a business card and a 401k. It came in the form of software sales finance jobs and multi-level marketing schemes that somehow always made more sense to them than what I did. Jacob fit right in. He spoke their language. He knew how to drop phrases like quarterly growth and IPO pipeline into conversation like seasoning. I, on the other hand, was the cautionary tale, the dropout, the disappointment they couldn't quite talk about without lowering their voices. They saw me as the family oddity who had traded her future for a badge and a uniform that didn't mean anything. And the truth is, I let them think that. It was easier than correcting them, easier than watching their eyes glaze over or their mouths tighten in polite confusion. Letting them believe I was a glorified mall cop was a small price to pay for keeping my real life separate. I'd stopped trying to explain myself a long time ago. My job wasn't in a mall. It wasn't in a lobby or a parking lot either. I worked in a federal task force under the Department of Justice, focused on uncovering financial crimes that didn't make the evening news, but shaped the world behind the scenes. We tracked dirty money. Shell companies' offshore accounts, fake charities. The kind of fraud that wore suits and shook hands over steak dinners. Every file we touched had real consequences. Evading taxes meant broken schools. Laundered money meant real victims who never saw justice. I was assigned to one of the largest investigations of my division that year. The case centered around a group of interconnected trusts used to disguise millions in illegal transfers. One of those trusts was named in passing at my family dinner by the man who had mocked me with a grin. Uncle Paul. It was surreal hearing the name I'd seen on sealed files fall so casually from his mouth. He thought he was boasting. What he didn't realize was that he'd just confirmed the final link we needed. I said nothing that night. I just smiled and nodded the same way I always had. No one in my family had ever asked what I did on a daily basis. Not really. They didn't know about the long hours, the wire transfers I had traced, or the meetings where I sat across from forensic accountants and federal prosecutors. They didn't know about the search warrants I helped write or the evidence I cataloged while the world slept. But that was fine. I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't need applause. What I needed was clarity. And in that moment, with Paul's careless words still hanging in the air, I had it. I had been quiet long enough. I had listened, endured, and kept my head down. But now I had the truth. And it was more powerful than anything they had ever believed about me. It happened over sweet potatoes and red wine. Paul was halfway through one of his grand stories, arms moving like he was on stage instead of at a dining table. He'd just come back from a trip to the Cayman Islands and couldn't resist letting everyone know how well his investments were doing. He leaned back in his chair, one hand around a crystal glass, and mentioned something about the Larimore Trust. Just the name. Casually, like it was a throwaway line. No one blinked. No one except me. That name had shown up on 2 warrants buried in a spreadsheet that had taken our team weeks to decode. It was the missing key. The trust we believed was shielding a set of offshore accounts tied to real estate laundering, and Paul, with his oversized confidence, had just confirmed it out loud in front of a bowl of stuffing. He looked directly at me when he said it, almost smug, like he was letting me in on a little adult secret I couldn't possibly understand. He smiled the way someone smiles when they're certain you don't matter. That smile told me everything I needed to know. In my head, the dots were already connecting. Dates, amounts, properties. I'd seen that name in filings linked to dummy corporations that led straight back to New Jersey, right where Paul's newest developments were breaking ground. It was reckless. Stupid even. But that's what arrogance does. It makes people sloppy. The room around me kept buzzing with laughter. My cousin was showing baby photos on his phone. My aunt asked for more wine. No one noticed the tectonic shift that had just happened across the table. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I just held the moment still in my mind, like a freeze frame. Paul thought he'd won something by putting me down again. What he didn't realize was that in trying to impress everyone else, he'd just handed me the last piece of the puzzle, and I would never forget it. The next morning, I walked into the federal building with the kind of clarity that doesn't leave room for doubt. I sat across from Assistant U.S. Attorney Lane, dropped the name of the trust, and watched his eyes sharpen. He didn't ask how I knew. He just nodded once and opened a folder already labeled Jensen. He offered me an out almost immediately. Given the personal connection, they could reassign the lead to another agent. No judgment, no questions, just a clean pivot. I didn't even pause. I said no. I told him I knew Paul's habits, his calendar, the weak points in his routines. I was the best chance we had at a clean apprehension, and I wasn't stepping aside. Lane studied me for a long second. Then he gave a tight nod and slid the packet across the table. My initials were already on the front typed under the words, Case Lead. The weight of it settled in my hands like a promise I'd already made to myself. That night, I stared at my ceiling long after the lights were off. I thought about what it meant to turn against blood, to become the one person in my family who saw something wrong and actually did something about it. It didn't feel noble. It felt cold, necessary, right. I wasn't doing this because I had something to prove. That part of me had died years ago. I was doing this because the law didn't care who someone's uncle was. And neither did I. Paul had built a life on lies, manipulation, and entitlement. He had trusted the silence of those too afraid to challenge him. But I wasn't afraid anymore. That part of me was gone. In that moment, I stopped being the girl they dismissed. I became the one they'd never see coming. And I chose the oath I took over the name I was born with. The briefing room was quiet, the kind of silence that comes when every person at the table knows what's at stake. I spread out the architectural blueprints of Paul's downtown office tower, circling the private elevator he bragged about every Christmas. It was tucked behind a glass wall, his personal escape route, in case of an emergency he never believed would come. Everything I needed, I had already learned from years of watching him talk too much. He once mentioned which parking garage entrance he used when he didn't want to be seen. He'd shown off the biometric lock on his office door during a family party like it made him bulletproof. Every word he ever said became intelligence. I built the operation around his routine. On Wednesdays, he met with investors at 10 a.m. sharp. The assistant always brought in coffee 5 minutes before. The building's front security changed shifts at exactly 9:45. We would move at 9:48. My team was small, efficient, and hand-picked for cases that needed speed and silence. Each one briefed on Paul's behaviors, exits, and habits. Every angle of his ego had been mapped like a battlefield. The plan was simple because it had to be. Lock the private elevator, cut off the stairwell from below, hit the suite from 2 sides before his feet left the carpet. There would be no room for interpretation, no time for him to charm or slip away. Senior Deputy Ramirez flagged the eastern hallway as the only blind spot. I assigned myself to that entry. I didn't tell them why, just marked the placement and moved on. That was the hallway where Paul always paused to admire his own portrait. The irony wasn't lost on me. His pride had always been his blind spot. And now it was mine to use. What he thought made him untouchable had become his most predictable flaw. The very stories he told to make himself look powerful were the same stories I would use to bring him down. The office smelled like citrus polish and expensive ego. Floor-to-ceiling glass bathed everything in sterile morning light. Paul stood behind his desk, flipping through a folder, completely unaware that the world he'd built was seconds from collapse. We moved in with quiet precision. The first team secured the hallway, cutting off the elevator. The second breached the main entrance shields, up commands, sharp and fast. He looked up, startled, but still cocky. That smirk he wore like armor didn't even crack until I stepped forward. For a split second, he froze. Recognition hit him like a car crash. His lips parted, but no words came out. I said nothing, just approached, steady and direct. My hands moved in practiced rhythm, gripping his wrist, twisting gently, securing the cuffs with a click that echoed louder than anything he could have said. He tried to speak, of course, tried to frame it like some misunderstanding. I kept my eyes on the warrant, read his rights like scripture. The procedure left no space for conversation. Behind me, someone snapped photos for documentation. His suit jacket bunched awkwardly beneath the restraints. His face, flushed and pale, at once looked smaller than I'd ever seen it. All the power, all the certainty drained out of him like air from a punctured balloon. I watched him closely, but not emotionally. This wasn't personal anymore. It was tactical, mechanical, necessary. He never saw me coming. That was the part that stuck with me. Not the noise, not the flash of headlines that would follow, but that 1 second where he looked at me and finally realized I wasn't who he thought I was. I was the shadow he ignored, the silence he never respected. And now I was the consequence he never expected. When we led him out, head low, hands bound, he passed the hallway with his own portrait. The frame tilted slightly like it were about to fall. No one touched it. No one even looked. He never saw me coming. But I had always seen this moment. And I was ready. The courtroom felt colder than usual. The air was heavy, dense with anticipation, and something unspoken that clung to every breath. My family filled the front rows, lined up like spectators at a play they didn't understand was about them. Paul sat at the defense table wearing the same tailored arrogance he always did. His lawyers flanked him like armor, shuffling papers, murmuring strategy. He looked more annoyed than nervous, still convinced this was all a mistake that money could fix. The prosecutor stood slowly. His voice was calm, but sharpened like a blade. The government calls Maya Jensen Deputy U.S. Marshal. My full title dropped into the silence like a weight. Every head turned. I stood up from the back row. Each step toward the witness stand felt like walking out of the life they had cast me in and into the one I had built. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My brother blinked, unsure if he was awake. Paul turned slowly, and when his eyes met mine, something inside him broke. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The color draining from his face said everything. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the room. I placed my hand on the Bible, raised the other, and swore to tell the truth. My voice didn't shake. When the prosecutor asked me to state my name and assignment, I answered with clarity that didn't need volume. I spoke as the law, not the niece. For the next 30 minutes, I gave detailed clinical testimony. I described the investigation, the evidence, the moment of arrest. I never called him Paul. He was the defendant. Just another subject in a federal case. The defense attorney tried to humanize it, tried to remind the jury I was family. Isn't it true, he asked, that the man you helped arrest is your uncle? I turned to the jury and said what I had carried in my chest since this began. Yes, but my oath is to the Constitution, not my family tree. The courtroom fell into a silence so sharp it almost hummed. The judge called for order. My mother looked like she had forgotten how to blink. Paul finally understood the reckoning had arrived. And it wore my face. I didn't smile. There was no victory lap. Just the cold, steady truth, standing in a room where I had once been invisible. They had called me a dropout, a disappointment. Now they had to call me what I had earned. Deputy Marshal. Witness. The one who brought him down.